Good evening, everyone. We Foundation course on disaster management organized by NDRG in collaboration with the theme for today is disaster law. NDRG has been working on disaster law and governance since 2013. In 2013, we went to Uttarakhand just after the flash floods to conduct a historic workshop on land management, and we asked a very relevant question that how much land a man needs, and witnessed the massive destruction caused by flash floods. One of the reasons for flash floods was the massive construction on the riverbeds and aberrant violation of building bylaws. We returned to JNU to only organize another unique workshop and inter-country consultation. And laws producing quality publications and research reports on disaster management since 2013 and adding the social science perspective to the whole scientific discourse of disaster management. The theme for today is disaster law, and we have a very illustrious the theme. So without further ado, I would like to request Professor Amita Singh, President NDRG, to introduce the. Thank you.
This is a very enlightening moment for all of us because we have some of the two top scholars who have been interacting with us for many years, and they have been contributing in a very transdisciplinary sphere of development of knowledge that feeds into disaster management. Monica, would you like to introduce the guest, because I don't have the introduction with me. So
okay, I thought I'll do it after you, but I'll introduce the okay, ma'am.
Yeah.
So on our panel today, we have Professor Sumaya Khair, who will be delivering on accountability and transparency concerns. Professor Sumaya Khair is a professor at the Department of Law, University of Dhaka, Bangladesh, and advisor executive management at Transparency International Bangladesh, country chapter of Transparency International, a Berlin-based anti-graft organization. She has a PhD from the United Kingdom, where she studied as a Commonwealth postdoctoral academic fellow. Her research expertise spans multi-dimensional fields such as human rights, access to justice and legal empowerment, refugees and migration, governance and anti-corruption, labor standards, child rights and gender issues, and has to her credit a number of publications in national and international journals and books. She is a regular contributor to the Asian Yearbook of International Law, where she writes on the state practice of international law, Bangladesh. Professor Khair sits on governing boards of a number of development and research organizations in Bangladesh, where she provides strategic advice on policy, programs, fundraising, and operations. She serves as a resource person in national, regional, and international forums and has consulted for UN agencies, ILO, ADB, and various international developmental partners. On behalf of NDRG, we welcome you, Professor Sumaya Khair. Our second panelist is Professor Ikramul Haq, who will be delivering on issues and compensation. Mohammad Ikramul Haq, PhD, is a professor of comparative constitutional law at the Department of Law, University of Dhaka, who did his PhD in constitutional law and international law from Monash University, Australia. He is the state volume editor of Bangladesh in the Encyclopedia of Public International Law in Asia. Professor Haq is the section editor of International Law and International Handbook of Disaster Research. He is a co-rapporteur in Asian Yearbook of International Law and is in the governing body of the development of international law in Asia. He is the coordinator of the clinical legal education program at the University of Dhaka and acts as a resource person for the training of judges and government officials in Bangladesh. He has delivered law lectures as an invited speaker in different universities and conferences at home and abroad. Sir Haq is a member of the research group on cross-judicial fertilization, the use of foreign precedents by constitutional judges, International Association of Constitutional Law, and the International Society of Public Law. He is the author of monograph on the constitutional law of Bangladesh in International Encyclopedia of Constitutional Law. Currently, he is co-editing two books which are in the works: The Constitutional Law of Bangladesh, Progression and Transformation at its 50th Anniversary, and implementation of sustainable development in the global south, its strategies, innovations, and challenges. We welcome you, sir, to the panel, and we look forward to your session. I now request Professor Amrita Singh to kindly introduce the theme.
Okay, thank you very much, Manika. This is, as I said, a very enlightening moment because there is nothing on disaster law as such which is being discussed anywhere in the country right now. And even in South Asia, I don't see that much is coming up in a specific area on disaster law. Of course, there are some segregated studies which are going on, as the nature of disaster law is that it's full of lots of transdisciplinary understandings, terminologies, and issues. So there is a lot which is happening, but we need more and more legal scholars to talk about it and divert their attention and their basic research into it. The first question that, well, I'm going to introduce this theme. So the first question that generally comes to the mind of any participant is that why should we be studying disaster law? Because we belong to mass media or to public administration or to sociology or to other area in administration. So why disaster law? If we do not have disaster law, in any case, you know that disaster is an anarchy. And that was the reason why it was the revenue department which was handling it, because all the money that the nation earned, much of it got washed away, was diverted during the period of a disaster. So nations were not picking up in development because the disasters ate away all the money. From the revenue department to the present situation that having a kingdom of its own is a big story. I'll just talk about it in short, that if we do not have disaster law, we'll have anarchy, in the sense that during disasters, whatever happens previous to the disasters, post disaster situations are so fuzzy that for ages and ages they were treated as part of an act of God. The supernatural powers were bringing disasters, and whenever there was a disaster, people used to kneel down and pray the sun and the moon and the stars and the wind and the fire that please save us. That was the situation. And not just in South Asia, where we have very, very deep religious roots, but also in the Western world. And I'll refer to, because we are going to go into aspects of law, and I'll refer to an important case, Nicholas and Martland. Most of us have gone through this case who are in law. 1875, they constructed in lakes. And when the water was full in the lake due to excessive rainfall, the construction fell down. And instead of impeaching the contractor who constructed in the lakes, natural lakes, it was termed by the judge as an act of God. And so, no liability was slapped on the other party that constructed. So from there, 1875 till today, we have an important turning point, and that was in 1999 in India. In 1999, the Saraswati Parabai versus the Grid Corporation of India, just one person died. That goes against the definition of a disaster in a natural sense, because a disaster is defined as the death of 10 or more people. But here only one person died. And that one person is Saraswati Parabai case. That one person died because of the grid failure, the grid corporation in Odisha. And everyone thought that they would say it's an act of God because the disaster took place, because of which the grid did not work or it malfunctioned. But surprisingly, a good judge was there on the desk, and he said, it's an issue of accountability. It's an issue of why the administration failed to provide that security, and the machine failure in times of crisis was a disaster, but a disaster caused by man. So from then onwards, the definition changed, and the act of God was shifted out, because there are lesser acts of God In fact, in today's disasters, there are no acts of God. It's all man-made disasters. So the whole terminology of disaster law changed, and the supernatural powers were asked to walk off. From there to Hyogo 2005, we come to a very defined role for the state, which is preparedness. You stay prepared. Why should a disaster be a cause for death and damage? And so we see that in the last 20 years, because the focus since the coming of Hyogo declaration in 2005, after the tsunami, uh, the world was shaken. And this law was very well accepted because we accept an unwanted thing only when we are dying. So Hyogo was accepted by 196 nations in United Nations. And then it was said that preparedness is the key. So states should be prepared to prevent disasters. And there comes the liability of the state for not acting. And we see that the states have started acting a little bit, but some nations are doing better, others are lesser, but most states are doing something. And the death and damage has been reducing since the coming of Hyogo in 20 years. Much reduced. It's been reduced by almost 65%. Then comes the Sendai, another piece of law, a very comprehensive law. 2015-2030 was the date in which this law has to be implemented. It defined another targeted approach, which is risk, that states should identify the risk. So what the states have been doing, there is mapping as a basic need. There is mapping taking place in the cities, and certain areas are in blue or in green, that nobody should construct in these areas because the green is the forest and the blue is the water bodies. But you see, this is decreasing. If you look at the map of Dhaka or you look at the map of Delhi, you see that this is continuously being decreased, and it's shrinking. And the wilderness areas are just being passed off in the land grabbing process. Now, of course, because there is carbon credit system in the Paris Pact, that if you have more forest, if you grow more greenery, then or more environmental areas, then you get some credits to release more CFCs, means to do more business. And if you are allowed to do more business, then you can develop. So like China and India, they're trying to grow in their forest areas. But this is so segregated, so disturbed, in the sense that it's not a dense forest in continuity, which we can say that a tiger can roam free from India to Dhaka through the Sundarbans. No, it's not like that. It's in pieces. So it's not really being very good for life. Actually, the life is becoming more threatened in the forest because of this segregated greenery system for the desire and greed for getting carbon credits in the international sphere. So we have Sendai, and the risk is to be identified, but at least now we have some law where we can say that at least there is an accountability of the government in identifying the risk. Later on, if there is a disaster, the government cannot wash its hands off and say, no, we didn't know that, it was an act of God. It can't say that. So, two very important principles in law gradually seep into governance. One is the contractual liability of the state, and second is the tortious liability of the state. We have not been using this because we are all post-colonial generation, so we haven't gone very, very strongly against the state, and we haven't asked very much from the state. And most of them who've been asking from the state are the turbulent tribes at the grassroots level, the actually educated, employed, well settled power holders are not really coming up on going to the courts with demand for contractual liability. If something happens, like in Chandni Chowk, there was this big fire yesterday, and our disaster research group in 2017 had given a report to the government that the way electricity wires and cables are hanging on, the buildings are so close, they are about to fall, many of them. So action should be taken instead of the cosmetic facelifting outside, which is visible for the tourists. You should do this because that's where people live, that's where business go downs are, storage centers are. So this did not happen, and there's a fire and massive loss to business now. Of course, the lives are saved, that's a different thing. So we come to one very important principle in disaster law, which was not linked with disaster law in the time when it came. That is in 1996, when the environment minister of this country had made a beautiful swan resorts at the fork of River Bias in 1992. In 1996, the court came up. MC Mehta, most of us know MC Mehta, Sumaya, Ikramul. They've been there in many of the courses organized by MC Mehta in Doiwala. And a large number of law students from Dhaka University, Pakistan, Maldives, and Nepal used to come and attend that. MC Mehta had put in a public interest litigation that it should be stopped. But it was the environment minister, a very powerful minister, and nothing could be done. But the case went on, and very fast in 1996, which is very fast, considering the time the cases take in the court, 1992 to 1996, the hammer came down of the judge and said that remove this swan resorts, the luxurious tourist resorts from there. The fork of the river cannot become an earning point for tourism. Why? Because this is an important ecological region. And being an ecological region, it should be well protected. And the state, why should the state protect it? Because there is a doctrine of public trust, which goes at the basic fundamental design of disaster law, public trust doctrine. I come next to the theoretical basis, the foundations of disaster law, as it is in all other laws. Every law has sometimes been not a law, whether in business or competition, whether contract, there have been no laws. Everything emerged from anarchy. So how did they emerge? How did they become a law? There is this fundamental design of equity that develops a law. And that fundamental design of equity is that which makes the law stronger. It's an ever-growing thing with equity because it inhibits systems of oppression. When I say systems of oppression, it inhibits systems of oppression. I mean that it goes by natural justice, it grows by good conscience, it grows by state forbearance to diversity, principle of fairness, and that's where disaster law needs all of us, legal scholars, non-legal scholars, people from different areas who need to participate and feed into it, because it doesn't need only legal scholars, it needs many of us. And I'll show you how. There have been other laws, some fundamental things that have come directly from equity and today have become the strongest pillars of laws. Say, for example, Pacta Santa Sarvanda, that treaties should be respected. Where did it come from? Why didn't the government shrug their shoulder off? Why should a treaty be respected? I am a different country. I rule my country. I would not respect this treaty, but they have to respect this treaty. And it is an important principle of national and international law. Then, say, for example, one very important principle that is always attracting my attention. It's a principle of promissory estoppel. Where is it? Estoppel is everywhere in every law. What is there in estoppel? We keep thinking, what is there in estoppel? Why is it, as a student of law, you keep thinking, why is estoppel everywhere? Because estoppel has something to do with our own honesty. Today I say something, tomorrow I may just go back on my words and say, oh, that was not what I said, that was not what I meant, my expression was different. No, there is a legal rule that it can be estoppel. So this is promissory estoppel, principle of estoppel, that precludes a person from denying the truth of some statement previously made by. Then there is another very, very important rule that comes from equity. Adi alteram partem, right of hearing. This right of hearing, why aren't we applying this right of hearing in disaster law? Say, for example, Athirapalli Dam in Kerala, people are sitting there making so much noise all these years. For the last at least 3 years, they've been making all the noise. The biggest environmentalists have visited those places, including Madhav Gadgil and other people. And the communities are saying that there ought to be a disaster if this Athirapalli Dam is constructed here. But nobody is listening. And the legal sphere, the legal scholars don't find it really worthwhile to go to the court and carry the voice of this third party to the court. That is where we need this, and people from different spheres have to bring things together to be heard. Then there is this other very important equity principle that's coming from equity. It's ground is equity, the womb is equity. That is nemo moriturus presumi for menture, which is man will not carry a lie when he is dying. He'll not carry a lie on his lips when he's dying. It's a principle from equity. It doesn't sound like law, but it's a piece of law, important piece of law. And those who are in disaster law, in fact, they are not part of disaster law. They are doing like in All India Institute of Medical Sciences, the forensic department is looking after the bodies, how the bodies are carried, what to do when after disaster they have to identify these bodies, take them to cremation, and they've gone through so much. Thousands of bodies have been coming down to them during the period of COVID, and they have to give the respect, they have to see how to identify, make them connected to their people, or anything that they wanted to say that has to be recorded properly. All that comes from the principle of equity. And I'll at this point, coming to the end of it, I'll point a very important principle that only I learned today. I was reading in Indian Express Professor Upendra Bakshi's article praising the Chief Justice Ramanna, who retired a few days ago. He mentioned a very important principle, that is hermeneutical judicial leadership. I never heard it earlier, this terminology. Hermeneutical judicial leadership, he meant interpretative leadership. Judges have a lot through this equity principle to interpret law as per the needs of a situation. In disaster management, they can interpret law, a lot of it, but they are sitting on a black letter law. They don't want to move. Don't want to burn their fingers because it's directly getting in antagonism with the state. And many of them prefer to play soft. But this interpretative power of the judges is the power that country needs. It's based on 5 principles, as I mentioned yesterday. One is equity, second is public trust, third is international humanitarian law, Pacta Santa Servanda. That is international humanitarian law. Certain treaties have to be respected, and relief, equitable relief is to be provided to disaster affected people. For example, right now, Pakistan is all being drowned because of this. 2/3 of Pakistan is under floods. We need to join hands, help them out as people to people approach. But that is demanded by disaster law, but we are not doing it. Then the carrying capacity, that to tell the government when to stop. No, judges are not doing that. When to stop. And people are not supporting the judges in saying when to stop. You can't go on digging, and then there is a mine blast that takes place, killing all the workers underground. Then you are entering, cutting the forest, and you enter at a place, then the forest fire, because all the humidity that prevented a forest fire is lost. So many of these things the court is expected to, and the 5th one is transdisciplinarity, that it is not only for the legal experts and the judges and the lawyers to play this game, it's for every citizen, because disaster law transdisciplinary area. So, taking an example from the recent Supertech towers in Noida, which were demolished in very bright sunlight in the middle of the day, and with very just 16 meters away from other mega towers, very dangerous situation. And yet, people cooperated with the government. They left their houses for 2 days to suffer in peace. And I would say, and I've written in my columns, that it is because the courts have not played a very sensible role. If they wanted, they could have slapped an injunction right in the beginning, but they use the pari passu approach that construction and justice discourse will go together. So the two things don't go together, and it's time that disasters demand that there must be immediate mandatory injunction to any wrong building, any wrong construction, anywhere in the riverbed or the ocean floor, wherever. So, so we have the constitutional powers of issuing writs under Section 32, and for the high courts under Section 226. Our Dhaka friends are going to share with us how this is being done in their country. And judges on the top of it also have a suo motu power. National Green Tribunal is applying the suo motu powers, and then the judge gets transferred. So there are all these issues that we have to deal with, and they are not legal issues, they are also governance issues, and they need a lot of support from the media for the disaster law to grow. Thank you very much. I end up here.
Thank you, Professor Amita Singh, for introducing the theme in such a fantastic fashion and putting forward the multifaceted complexities as far as the interplay of law, disaster management, and governance is concerned. I now welcome and request Professor Sumaya Khair to deliver on accountability and transparency in disaster management. Over to you, Sumaya, ma'am.
Thank you, Manika. And Amita, as always, an excellent articulation of the links between law, governance, and the environment, and of course, sustainability. A warm welcome to all the participants. I understand that this is a mixed group of, from multidisciplinary backgrounds. And what I'm about to share with you is not really all law. It's about accountability and transparency, elements that I think are taught in schools very early on as part of our ethical training. I'm sure, I don't know what kind of sessions you had yesterday, but and forgive me for being presumptuous that you are not going to be aware of what disasters are and what disaster management is all about. But I beg your indulgence and would like to sort of flag with you a certain two certain definitions of disasters and disaster management, which I thought was, were simple enough to get the message across, particularly with regard to what these particular phenomena actually entailed. If you look at the IFRC, the International Federation for Red Cross definition, it's very simple, and they say that disasters are serious disruptions to the functioning of a community that exceed its capacity to cope using its own resources. Disasters can be caused by natural, man-made, and technological hazards, as well as various factors that influence the exposure and vulnerability of community. I think this entire gamut of elements that has been captured by IFRC were also flagged by Amita in her introductory talk. When it comes to disaster management, we know how we manage things. We manage offices, we manage homes, we manage disasters, be it the natural disaster or a man-made disaster. But basically, it's all about effectively preparing for and responding to these disasters. And these have to be done strategically. You have to organize resources. You have to do that in order to lessen the harm and the risks that Amita was alluding to earlier that the disasters pose. And you can see from this definition that it also involves a systematic approach to managing the responsibilities of disaster prevention, preparedness, response, and I think one of the vital and extremely significant aspects of disaster management is recovery. So this is what I have used to actually set the tone of my talk. I wouldn't call it a lecture, but this is more of a talk, and I would hope to engage with you at a later stage. So what is the context that brings us to this this particular event of today, or even to the demand and the need and the recognized need for knowing about disaster management, disaster law, and disaster governance? From my perspective, I think the context would be that I think in the experience of many countries to date, disaster management is particularly vulnerable to corruption. And corruption basically eats into our whole society. Corruption increases poverty and vulnerability and discrimination. Poverty impedes development. Poverty and corruption impedes justice delivery, equity, and access to justice, equality. And what happens during a disaster is that you suddenly find that there's a sudden flow of large amounts of money and goods and services, whether it's from your own national sources or from abroad. And again, this is coupled with the need to deliver aid quickly, because that's one of the fundamental premises of disaster management. Reach assistance quickly, which all come together to heighten the risk of corruption. Now, the post-emergency rehabilitation and reconstruction phases also create substantial economic and business opportunities, which also make room for corruption. And you can see that I have listed three main reasons that actually contribute to this vulnerable situation. One is resources in the form of humanitarian assistance are often large, very large, in fact, compared to the absorption capacity of many nation states, particularly within the short span of time in which humanitarian assistance is rendered. This is a major concern. Given the urgency involved, we have traditional conventional tools and institutions of accountability, but which often get undermined, again, in turn, creating scope for corruption and irregular practices. And thirdly, like most pro-needy, pro-vulnerable initiatives, humanitarian assistance is influenced by asymmetric power, unequal power relations between the assistance provider on the one hand and the assistance recipient on the other. So these are the basic, attributes that actually come together to enhance or increase the vulnerability post-disaster. I think back in 2006, what I'm going to talk about this afternoon is mostly drawn on from my experience in working with Transparency International Bangladesh and working very closely with the head office in Berlin, which is Transparency International. And back in 2006, TIS actually undertook a corruption risk mapping survey. And they came up with these basic parameters and observations, which I think hold true even today. So they found that where corruption is pervasive, risk of integrity lapse in humanitarian assistance is very high. They also found that proportions of humanitarian assistance funds reaching actual victims, the true victims, is low, with a substantial portion lost to corrupt individuals or groups. They also found that corruption in humanitarian assistance takes place in a complex web of public representatives, political leaders and their agents, government officials at different tiers, police, and the local elite. We know that disaster management cannot be handled singly by any particular institution or body or even civil society. We would have to have a complex arrangement of stakeholders across the board. That is a necessity, but that also is a breeding ground of corruption and irregular practices. The unequal asymmetric relations, which I spoke about earlier, also prevent disclosure and discourse, because there's a lot of intimidation, there's fear on corruption, and that essentially restricts recipients' participation and choice, leading to loss of opportunities and income. These broadly, basically I've captured this as an overview of the corruption risk mapping survey results of Transparency International globally. Now, what do we know about this? There are differences between how disaster is managed by developing economies and developed economies, but there's certain common parameters, but I would sort of try and take you through very briefly in what we know about these disconnects. In poor developing countries, it is known that fundamental and systemic limitations such as ineffective governments, we know of that very well, being in South Asia, inequality, and a lack of resources, particularly at the local levels, along with a lack of trust, basically impede effective disaster governance. In developing economies also, lessons learned commonly call for better stakeholder involvement, which is largely missing often. Capacity building, decentralization, and devolution or the transfer of power and authority to local levels, which are also largely missing in many of our jurisdictions. If you look at the developed countries, you find that disaster governance failures are generally rooted in ineffective or inadequate constitutions of the disaster governance network itself. They're not short on resources, they're not short on systems, but it is all about coming together in a network and working together and with the proper representation, collaboration, coordination, or inflexibility. So this is the scenario as far as developed jurisdictions are concerned. Scholars have also pointed out that weak civil societies that limit the effectiveness of disaster governance can be found, strangely, in both rich and poor countries. And civil societies in most of our jurisdiction actually offer a very powerful third force, and they actually encapsulate local voices. But if civil societies are restricted in their activities, in voicing their concerns and flagging their concerns and raising demands for disclosure of information, that can actually impede the effectiveness of disaster governance in more ways than one. If I run you through the Bangladesh experience, there have been incidents of corruption and malgovernance in disaster management, which varied according to the typology, nature, and scale of the disaster. I think, like many of our countries in the region, Bangladesh has had its own share of disasters. We have seen building collapses, garment factory collapse. Some of you may recall the famous Rana Plaza incident. We have fire accidents which have taken place over the years in many of the factories where people were trapped inside and could not be rescued. There were, of course, the recurrent cyclones and floods, which are very common in Bangladesh. And not only in 2017, but dating years back, we have the Rohingya influx, which have, caused innumerable, it has an enormous pressure on the resources of Bangladesh, and also pressure on how to manage this disaster. And finally, and not the least, is the COVID-19 pandemic, which has sort of, catapulted the entire region, and of course, Bangladesh is no exception, into something which is completely unknown. It's an unknown quantity to most of our countries in South Asia. Now, if I were to sort of give you an overview of what were the most common factors which had impeded disaster management during all of these numerous disasters that I speak of, they include, but they're not necessarily limited to what I have to say right now, but they include lack of proper assessment, strategic planning, vulnerability mapping, disaster preparedness. All of these elements have been touched on very aptly by Amita in our introductory talk. And sadly, we join conferences, we sign up MOUs, and we engage in government to government agreements and what have you. But when it actually comes to proper assessments and planning and mappings and preparedness, I think we have a long, long way to go. We are hardly prepared in any of these departments. Of course, that is roped in very directly with the lack of institutional capacity. And this institutional capacity is in terms of actually having sufficient knowledge, not only sufficient knowledge, but the necessary relevant knowledge, the skills, finance, the human resources. We have institutions, we have a mushroom, of institutions, we have mushroomed over the years, but the manpower, the knowledge power, the skills power departments are sadly deficient in standard skills and capability. When there's a disaster, there is a need for coordination among different agencies. Now, in Bangladesh, we have seen that there is a very sad lack of coordination that has actually resulted in knee-jerk, skewed responses. Half of the time, those are inadequate, inefficient responses, and which also results in very inaccurate, inappropriate disaster management schemes and distribution of relief. In all this, you will find that the people for whom you're supposed to be doing all this are actually missing from the picture. You don't find them participating in planning. You don't see them, they're not visible in priority setting. So in other words, we might not be giving them what they actually need, but we might be giving them something totally different and spending and wasting a lot of resource on that. We see that there are skewed allocations and disbursement of relief and aid. These are routine and some of the most common features that we see in disaster management failures. And the other thing, which recently I think we have improved a bit, but there's a long way to go, which is how quick are you to respond to disaster? So there are delays. Some of the delays are linked to the elements that I have mentioned above. And the other delays are, I think, a lot to do with the people themselves, because they're not aware of the risks and dangers that they are likely to face if they do not cooperate with disaster management actors or actors in governance. We have also found in many cases there's an absence of grievance redress system. It is not only the absence of redress, the act of lodging complaints itself is very culturally frowned upon, culturally discouraged, where people feel that if you complain, you might get singled out and you might be persecuted. But there is also this entire absence of a grievance redress system. So people really actually don't know where to go if they have a complaint at all. This have serious implications for effective disaster management. Lack of transparency in disaster management measures, including implementing partner selection. So government, of course, is not able to implement all the disaster management measures. They actually partner with NGOs, they partner with the development actors. And we have found deficiencies and lack of transparency and nepotism in actually selecting partners who will work in the management process. And even how these partners are selected are, you do not have sufficient information. What is the criteria on the basis of which you have selected your partners? These informations are always not really there for the public to see and draw on. We have also found gaps in oversight and accountability. The management measures and the management actors have very little internal control. This includes poor financial management. And on top of that, whenever there is a disaster unfolding and the disaster management actors are propelled into action, there is not adequate or even proper monitoring by relevant stakeholder organizations, if they're doing it right, or if they're providing the right kind of assistance and help, or if they're doing the right kind of networking and collaboration. All of these are actually are not looped in the monitoring process. One of the biggest, I think one of the biggest areas of corruption is the procurement process. And we have seen this throughout many of our disasters in this country, and I'm sure this is a global scenario. The procurement process is one of the most critical junctures where a lot of actually corruption takes place. And you will not find, we have gone into e-procurement process, but our research has actually revealed that people are so smart. They have also learned the ropes of, sidelining or even bypassing the e-procurement process. Amazing. If they had only used this intelligence for better services of the people and humanity, I think we would have gone a long way. But even the e-procurement processes have been breached. So this is another area which needs serious consideration, and we have been, systematically failing to address these breaches. One of the things I think which is common to a lot of South Asian jurisdiction is corruption, collusion, and irregularities, whether it is due to undue political influence, whether it is through harassment or intimidation, whether it's through nepotism, bribery, and of course, conflict of interest. You will find a lot of conflict of interest cases where people who have direct interest in how the management and the financial resources are disbursed, who will also be actually calling the shots of where the resources will go, they will benefit, which are the areas that the relief will be sent to, etc., etc. So there are serious conflict of interest issues in Bangladesh. Embezzlement and pilferage, a very commonplace of relief materials. Soon after a disaster is over, or even when the disaster is ongoing, you will find that the local markets are flooded with relief materials which were supposed to be actually delivered to the victims. You will find, starting from food, from tent, from clothing, everything that was supposed to be, from biscuits, from packets of juice, or what have you, everything that the local markets you will find that you can actually buy them for a price. During all this time, taking advantage of these deficiencies and lacuna, we have these very smart fake outfits, which just, emerge overnight. And they're there to divert the relief materials to the black market. And during the COVID pandemic, we have been privy to this, where a lot of the medicines and the masks, they've all sort of profiteered through the diversion to the black market. And there's this thriving business which takes place to the detriment of the poor victims of the disaster. Now, all of these areas of concern which I have flagged without mercy go back to what Amita flagged earlier, is that there is this culture of impunity, where we see that people who are culpable and liable for all these misdemeanors and deficiencies and corruption and inefficiencies, they go scot-free. They are not held accountable. Rather, in many cases, we have seen that they are actually being rewarded. So the theory or the practice of reward and punishment actually, get completely lopsided. You find people who are guilty of all of these are being rewarded, and they are very close to the authorities and the administration. And people who would actually blow the whistle on a corrupt individual or a corrupt practice would get penalized or even criminalized. So, and this is fed, I think this culture of impunity feeds on the total lack of political will to do better, to give better services to the people, to ensure better accountability, to ensure transparency and the flow of information, and above all, to actually the political will to serve the people. Because we become so self-serving, we are so busy trying to mollify and please people in the hierarchy. And we are so busy playing the role of sycophants that we actually lose sight of our real target and goal, which is actually to serve humanity during disasters. As we talk about corruption and good governance, I'm sure all of you are aware there are many indicators of good governance. But the key indicators in this entire discourse are transparency and accountability. Because transparency is the principle of openness. It allows the public to know and acquire the widest possible access to information. And we have learned, I think, early on in school that knowledge is power. Knowledge protects you, it empowers you, it helps you to ask questions, challenge inequities and inequalities. But unless you are given a platform from which you can utilize this power, sometimes knowledge can be very frustrating as well. Because here you are empowered and raring to go, but the entire system is so designed that you cannot actually utilize your knowledge. That can be very counterproductive, very frustrating and disappointing. And this happens to many of our law students, law practitioners, because I know what is going on is wrong, but I can't challenge it because of the culture of impunity, because of the political forces and what have you. Transparency, on the other hand, requires actors in governance to proactively disclose the what, the why, and the how of disaster management initiatives, practices, and processes, which have a direct bearing on the lives of the victims and the people who are at the end, who are on the receiving end of the disasters. So, you know, there are systems in our country, I'm sure India also has it, you know, we have the Right to Information Act in place. But why would I need to even access a Right to Information Act? Because I have the right to know anyway. Why will the state and the government machinery not inform me proactively? Because it is their duty to do so. Why do I have to actually write letters and seek audiences with the Information Commission to access information which I'm supposed to get as of right? So transparency basically talks about proactive disclosure. And we see a serious deficiency in that department as well. Of course, accountability is an obligation where you have to explain why you have succeeded, which is good, why you have failed in terms of any initiatives, practices, and processes, and whether you have been able to achieve the stated goals and objectives. How have you used the funds which have been allocated to address these objectives? Have you spent them economically, efficiently, and effectively? So where did the money go? We know that, you know, Bangladesh, India, we are on the receiving end of the climate change impact. So, and by default, we are also privy and beneficiaries of large amounts of money coming to you know, aid us adapt to climate change impacts. So where does this all this money go? You track the money and you will find that they are going into very ineffectual, inappropriate projects designed for climate adaptation and mitigation. Half of the projects don't make sense. Half of the projects do not actually reach the benefits to the people who deserve them. So, like any other sector, the effectiveness of disaster governance primarily hinges on these two central elements of transparency and accountability. And there are a number of ways, of course, whereby you can actually ensure that this is done. Now, that said, I will say something. So why set governance standards in disaster management? So as I have indicated earlier, there are various factors which are institutional, systemic, contextual, which directly or indirectly contribute to corruption in different phases of disaster management. And that's a given. This is an unavoidable reality. And the conditions in which disaster management occur are also characterized by damaged or destroyed infrastructure, disrupted community services, mass population movements, you know, involuntary movements, outbreaks of disease, and actual or unanticipated conflicts. Again, we have this urgent need to reach affected populations quickly, which I've mentioned earlier. When you do that, this often erodes local governance structures, due process, and integrity practice, because then you actually, caution is sort of, it's blown to the winds. You really don't care about caution anymore. All you care about is how to reach these people fast and quickly. But doing that, you might result in inaccurate disbursement of relief and aid, manipulation and misuse of aid flows, growth of parallel and often illegal outfits like back markets, which operate in the political and economic vacuum created by the emergence. And there is, of course, the diversity of actors, not all of whom are honest, not all of whom have integrity, not all of whom are accountable, involving the government, NGOs, development partners, private contractors, and military forces. You have diverse implementation modalities, each operating under different sets of norms and guidelines, with diverse approaches, differential reporting requirements. All of these actually create scope for corruption. In this context, I think it would be safe bet to say that transparency and accountability in terms of fund flow, information dissemination, decision-making, disbursement planning, stakeholder, that is aid recipient identification and selection, and aid utilization and distribution are some of the critical elements for ensuring good governance in disaster management. Now, the obvious question as I end is that, would this really work? I'm not saying these elements are biblical, that they are like the perfect solution to an imperfect situation. No, but these are certainly reference points which you can use to hold people or actors in governance accountable. These are reference points which you can use in your research to further policy directions and contribute to policy formulation. As Amita said, why disaster law? I mean, most of the laws that we have were probably developed to be broken. We see that laws are in place, but there is very lack or ineffective implementation. That is where the political will comes in to play. So we have laws which are broken, even criminal laws are broken, constitutional laws are breached. We have laws, and many people who are non-lawyers ask us, what's the point of having a law in place? The point is that otherwise there would be no rule-following behavior. There would be complete anarchy, even with the laws in place. Imagine what would we be facing if the laws and the systems were not in place. I think this group, and led by Amita and people who are contributing to this process, our responsibility is to make people aware. But awareness in itself is not sufficient. You actually have to mobilize for change. And you have to create a demand on the one hand, and you have to create on the other hand a supply. So if there is too much demand, like say too much demand for anti-corruption, and there is no supply of anti-corruption, that would again be counterproductive. So there has to be some level of demand. So when you create demand, you have to engage citizens. You have to engage civil society. And many people in Bangladesh say, we have been working with anti-corruption. TIB has been working with corruption for the last 26 years. So we are now still topping the CPI, the Corruption Perception Index of TIS. So how come? So what's the point? That's the whole point. The point for human rights defenders, for environmentalists and actors, for anti-corruption actors, we have to stick around to make a difference. We have to empower people to defend themselves, to protect themselves, and to demand change and justice. And I think what better way than to start now, perhaps with this online training, which Amita and her very able, competent, facilitators have actually brought together, I think, in these 3 days. With this, I'm going to end. Thank you very much for bearing with me. If we have time, we can take questions.
Thank you, Professor Sumaiya Khair, for such a fascinating session and ending on mobilizing for change. I would like to announce that the participants can keep pasting their questions in the chat box, and we will take all the questions towards the end of both the sessions. And I now request Professor Ikramul Haq to kindly deliver his lecture. Thank you.
Sorry, can I just intervene, Manika?
Yes, please. Yes, ma'am.
I'm afraid I cannot take questions afterwards
Okay.
because
Okay.
I have to go to another meeting. But do take the questions, and if you can email them to me, I'll be more than happy to answer them.
Sure, sure. And if you have few minutes, we can ask our participants if they have any question.
Okay, sure.
So if anybody is having question for Professor Sumaiya Khair, kindly paste it in the chat box or can unmute themselves and ask. Anybody? Okay. So if there is any,
it's fine.
yeah, if there is any, we will get in touch with you through email, ma'am.
Excellent.
Amita ma'am, you are on mute.
I think
You are on
Amita
mute.
say something.
I have a question, because
Yeah.
Sumaiya's work on transparency is excellent all throughout, for the last many years. I've been seeing that. Sumaiya, do you think, because Bangladesh also has a disaster management act, do you think that many of these principles, many of these imperatives could be absorbed into the disaster management act of Bangladesh to make it a little more implementable?
To make them more robust, of course. I mean, there are always initiatives from the civil society to actually enrich our laws in more ways than one. And I think a lot of what's transpiring today, if you could sort of transform them into policy briefs, that would be an excellent way of feeding into our the minds of our policymakers. One of the approaches that Transparency International Bangladesh takes is that we do evidence-based research. And then what we do is, because nobody has the time to go through, the policymakers don't have time to sort of read up on the research. So what we do is we extract the main findings and we make very structured policy briefs, trying to do like short-term, mid-term and long-term recommendations. And we have seen that that actually works. So this could well be an opportunity to be pushing some of our recommendations to the right places, to the policymakers. Indeed, it could be one way of doing this.
So you have local courts. Shalish are still working, right?
Oh, yes.
So Shalish could be, some way trained in dealing with the disaster cases, because Shalish and panchayats at the local level, they are the front, they're the front runners, in case of providing relief to the affected people.
Yes, Amita. I mean, we have sort of, moved away from our traditional Shalish system, which tended to be patriarchal and rather myopic. But lately now the Shalish, like for example, I have experience of involving the Shalish to mitigate migration fraud cases.
Yes,
At TIB, we have used the local platforms, not Shalish, but local citizens organizations to actually take on complaints related to climate governance. So we have that experience. But that said, even within local communities, there are elements which you need to guard against. There are political elements, there are people who might subvert your initiatives. So you have to be very careful when you are selecting those particular groups, when you work with them. And of course, they have to go through a very, I think, intense training process so that they know exactly what they should be looking out for. Because our traditional Shalish, they do mostly family matters and petty issues. But issues like disaster management, issues like climate change impact and corruption, they are learning, but they have a long way to go. But we have already started the process.
Good, thank you.
Thank you, Amita. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Sumaya ma'am, for
Bye-bye.
taking time out of your busy schedule and delivering such a fantastic and an enlightening lecture.
Thank you very much. My pleasure, Manika. You take care, everybody.
Same
Stay
to you,
well.
ma'am.
Bye,
Thank you.
Amita. Catch up with you later. Bye-bye.
We now welcome Professor Ikramul Haq, whom we have already introduced, for delivering his session on compensation, issues in compensation.
Well, I think Dr. Manika, I'll be focusing more on regional cooperation.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
disaster law,
right,
focusing
that's
on
right.
regional cooperation. Yeah. Well, let me
Right.
share the screen first. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And at the very outset, I must be thankful to the organizers for organizing and taking an initiative to hold such a very important training program, which is equally important for both Bangladesh and India, I think. And I'm sure that in near future, if this particular training session is repeated, there will be a number of participants from Bangladesh who will be joining, because some of them already have expressed their willingness to participate in such a program, including a government official and a number of faculty members from different universities in Bangladesh. Such a wonderful, such an important training session for all of us, actually. So I'm thankful to the organizers, and especially thankful and grateful to Professor Amita Singh for giving me this honor to speak before the participants. Well, we all know that international disaster law is actually a very big area and a complex area as well, because unlike international human rights law or international humanitarian law, this is not an independent branch of law, or rather, it is built on a number of areas. So it covers a number of branches of law at the same time. And in that sense, this is a very complex area and a very wide area as well. So it is neither possible nor my objective to cover everything regarding international disaster law. Rather, I will set my tone with certain basic ideas about disaster law, and then I'll be focusing more on regional cooperation and legal provisions regarding international assistance and regional cooperation, because the issue of international assistance is very important for disaster management, because in most of the cases that the experience from worldwide, including the developed nations, the experience shows that it becomes impossible for the states to face disasters by their own capacities without having international assistance. Even many developed nations fail to face those disasters without having proper international assistance and regional cooperations. And from that perspective, we can say that the issue of international assistance and regional cooperation is very important. That's why I'll be focusing more on that particular perspective of disaster law. Well, since it's going to be a training session, so at the very outset, I'm giving some references to some very important resources relating to my lecture. And another thing I must say that it is 88 slides. There are 88 slides in this PowerPoint presentation. I'm not going to describe all slides in my 20 or 30 minutes lecture, but of course I'll share it with the organizers, and I'm sure that this particular PowerPoint presentation will be shared with the participants, and if the organizers can manage it, they can share the online link. If the relevant or concerned libraries have access to these particular resources. Well, regarding disaster law, there are 4 books which are very important and essential to study. Number 1, Disaster Law, Emerging Thresholds, that has been edited by our favorite professor, Professor Amita Singh, which has been published from Routledge in 2018. Then International Law of Disaster Relief, Cambridge, it was published in 2014. Then International Law in Disaster Scenarios Flavia Zorzi. This is the most recent one, and an excellent book, I must say, that which has been published from Springer in the last year. An international disaster response law that has been also published by Springer in 2012. So these are the 4 books which you may read afterwards, after my lecture, which will definitely enlighten you regarding disaster law, because I cannot cover everything in 30 minutes. So I'm trying to giving you a guideline, a solid guideline. And there are 4 book chapters which are essential. Number 1, on disaster law, written by Professor Amita Singh, on disaster law that has been written by Gabriel Amari. In the same book on disaster law and emerging thresholds, edited by Amita Singh, I have found 4 different chapters in that particular book, which are essential and related to my lecture. And number 3, building national resilience through international law. And the last one has been written focusing on Indian disaster management law, the disaster laws in India, the way forward, that has been written by Nivedita P. Haran in the same book edited by Professor Amita Singh. And one particular website will be immensely useful for the study on disaster law, that is the IFRC website. I have already shared the link of that particular website with you all. Well, let me shed some light on the origin and development of the disaster management law, disaster law. Well, we all know that even international law is not a very old idea, in the sense of it's coming through the United Nations, or in the sense of its modern acceptance. International law has been matured only in the recent times in different areas, and this particular area is not an exception to that generality. And international disaster law has only been developed after 1920. In 1921, there was a concept of establishing International Relief Union, IRU, and which was eventually passed in 1932. But IRU eventually failed. Due to the resource constraints and financial constraints. And later in 1971, Office of the United Nations Disaster Relief Coordinator was established by a General Assembly resolution. And that found difficulties in the deployment of relief supplies and the unpreparedness of the states' internal orders. That particular preparedness of different states to face disasters is also very important, that we'll see later in my lecture. Well, in 1977, ECOSOC decided to recommend to states the adoption of a set of non-binding measures to expedite international relief. And of course, those measures were non-binding. We'll see eventually that there are a lot of guidelines that have been developed in the area of disaster law, which actually are in the nature of soft law instead of binding law. And if you understand the basic tone of international law, then that will not be a problem, because in international law, you don't have to have everything in strictly binding form. So even a moral principle, a soft guideline is also much important, is also of much importance in international legal practice. Well, in 1984, that particular office, which was established back in 1971, that prepared a draft convention on expediting the delivery of emergency assistance. But that convention was not eventually passed, because one of the reasons was the excessive priority was given to the state sovereignty of receiving states. One of the authors think that that was the main reason behind not passing that particular convention. So eventually, it was treated as to be a soft law. And later, in 2002, United Nations Secretary General took an initiative to adopt a convention concerning deployment and utilization of urban rescue teams. A resolution was adopted. Although he tried to pass a convention, that effort failed, but a resolution was adopted. So eventually, we'll see that there are a lot of bilateral agreements, bilateral treaties, and there are a number of regional arrangements. Yes, Professor Jayashree, I live with that. Well, there are a lot of bilateral treaties that have been adopted, and there are many regional amendments that have been made regarding disaster law. Well, and in summary, you can say that eventually what we got, that there is no strictly binding system which has been developed at the international level. However, there is a good news that IFRC worked hard on the issue of harmonization of different disaster laws, and it tried to make a convention. It has already adopted a model law as well. If you have time in your hands, please go through the model law that has been developed by the IFRC, which is available on the website. But the most fascinating thing which was done by IFRC is the IDRL guidelines. So nearly 40 countries around the world, they have made laws, already they have made laws in line with IDRL guidelines. And if we can ensure that one particular country is making its own law, disaster laws, in line with those IDRL guidelines, then of course there will be uniformity at international level among all domestic laws. Because if you talk about international collaboration, then if my law differs with Indian law differs with Nepalese law, there will be some practical problems in the entire process of disaster management. And that's why we need to have some, if possible, as far as practicable, to adapt laws of similar nature worldwide in different domestic jurisdictions. And that particular IDRL guidelines has served that particular purpose, that already nearly 40 countries have adopted their laws in line with those guidelines. And there are at least 10 to 12 other countries which are in the process of making their laws in accordance with the IDRL guidelines. Well, as I've already said, that the legal framework of disaster is a hybrid area that includes many things from international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and international disaster law as well. So this is, in that sense, this is going to be a very complex area. Well, let's now focus on a very important issue of international disaster law, that is the sovereignty of the receiving state. Because if you talk about the question of assistance or international assistance, then a question sometimes arises that will that hamper the sovereignty, or will there be any sort of possibility of destroying the culture of that particular country? So if you look at the guidelines, then we'll see that that particular guideline has actually treated seriously the concept of a state sovereignty. And a state sovereignty is important from three different perspectives. Number one, that particular affected state is primarily responsible to tackle the disaster. So there may be other international actors or states to render support for disaster management, but the thing is that the primary responsibility will be on the shoulder of that particular affected state. Secondly, it will be the decision of that particular affected state whether it requires to have any assistance from any international actor or any foreign state. So this is the decision of the affected state, that whether international assistance or the assistance from any international organization or actor would be required. Thirdly, the territorial state sovereignty also implies the competence on the one hand to establish regulatory framework, and at the same time, it will have the duty to coordinate the entire disaster management works and activities and international assistance activities. So if you ask me the question that what is the nature of disaster law, then of course, the single answer to that question is that this is a soft law in many respects. In international area, it includes many soft laws instead of binding laws. Okay, and sometimes customary international laws play a very important role in disaster law. And there is another source of international law, which also plays a very significant role in international disaster law, that is the general principles of law recognized by civilized nations. General principles of law recognized by civilized nations. This particular source of international law plays immensely important role in international law generally, and that is equally important for international disaster law. Well, now let us have a question. If a particular state offers to solicit assistance, is that good or bad? So can a country consider it something that it may hamper its own sovereignty? Will take it negatively or positively? The answer is such an offer to solicit assistance is not to be taken negatively. And it was settled back in 1969 by the Red Cross Declaration of Principles for International Humanitarian Relief to the civilian population in disaster situations. It said that the offer of disaster relief by an impartial international humanitarian organization ought not to be regarded as an unfriendly act. It must not be taken as such. Can you now say that, is there any right to offer assistance? Is that a right of a particular country to offer assistance? International Law Commission considered it positively, although it could not adopt it finally. But it has remained as a soft law. It has remained as a soft law that yes, such that offer can be solicited for assistance. Well, now let me focus on international legal principle regarding consent to receive assistance. I think there is some noise coming from your part, not from my side.
I hope, sir, it is fine now.
Okay.
I just muted all the participants. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so consent to receive assistance. Without consent, no assistance can be rendered to any particular country. It is very essential. And international law is very careful about this particular issue of consent. The thing is that, is there any exception to that consent? The answer is yes. In a very serious circumstance, sometimes in certain countries, that consent may not be required. For example, the states which are parties to 1949 Geneva Conventions, they do not require to give consent separately to Red Cross or Red Crescent for rendering assistance. So if they want to render any assistance for any sort of assistance, then the consent will be assumed that they have already consented to that particular assistance. Well, regarding the guidelines, I'll be focusing on some important points, except instead of going through different provisions directly, because that will be highly time consuming. So the context that justifies the idea is that the world actually needed such type of guidelines to harmonize their laws and to bring all relevant laws under a single umbrella of a disaster law. So that particular justification led towards the adoption of the IDRL guidelines. Well, but if you ask me the question that that particular guideline have any sort of binding force, then of course, strictly legally speaking, they do not have the binding legal force, but they have the binding force as international legal morality, or perhaps as the principles of customary international law as well, because of adherence of different states to different principles adopted in those particular guidelines. Well, what are the core ideas of those guidelines? There are 4 core ideas. Number 1, domestic actors have the primary role, as I have already said, that This is the primary responsibility of all states concerned who are the affected states by the disaster. Secondly, international relief providers have responsibilities. So they are not being given an open check to deal with the situation. Rather, they have some specific obligations and responsibilities to render different types of services as assistance. Number three, international actors need legal facilities. So there are certain specific provisions, and each and every particular country should make some specific provisions regarding awarding legal facilities to international actors, and some legal facilities should be conditional. There are certain key definitions, which please go through those definitions provided in the IDRL. And for example, the term disaster has been defined. I'm not going through that particular definition, but I just like to focus on three words: that it may be caused by accident, by nature, or by human activity. So there are many disasters which are caused actually by human activities. And as preventive measures, all states should make adequate laws so that we can at least prevent those man-made disasters. And there is a specific meaning, legal meaning of the term disaster relief, specific meaning of initial recovery assistance, and a specific meaning of assisting actor. Assisting actor means any state or any international organization who is going to rendering assistance to that particular affected state. Well, let me now tell something about the legal framework for disaster risk management. Legal framework. The first question: who has the primary responsibility? The answer is the affected state has the primary responsibility to ensure disaster risk reduction, relief, recovery assistance in their own territory. Then, is there any obligation to ask for international assistance? That means, does that depend on the sweet will of a particular country to ask for assistance, or is there any legal obligation under international law? The answer is in accordance with Guideline 3, if an affected state determines that a disaster situation exceeds national coping capacities, it is very important that has this exceeded my ability. In that case, it should seek international or regional assistance to address the needs of affected persons. And in doing so, this particular determination to be made by the state must not be done whimsically. So every discretion that has been given by the law, in every law, is to be exercised judiciously, rationally, logically, nor arbitrarily or whimsically. Well, now how will you make a balance between the sovereignty of the state and international law? It is true that the state will perform all relevant activities and will coordinate, regulate, monitor disaster relief and recovery assistance activities. That is the sovereign right of the state, true, but that must be consistent with international law. That must be consistent with international law. Here, international law has been given primacy over the national law. It is a very important point because we know that there are two different theories of international law in terms of the application of international law in one particular domestic jurisdiction. One is known as monist theory, another is dualist theory. For example, India is a dualist country, Bangladesh is a dualist country, or Nepal is a dualist country. So if there is a conflict between international law and national law, then national law will prevail according to dualism. But whenever we talk about the application of disaster law, then we'll be talking about the standard. Then in that particular sense, international law should be given primacy over the domestic law. It's a very important guideline that the state must ensure that international legal standard has been complied with. So this particular direction is applicable even for a country which is not a monist one. Because for a monist country, it is natural that will give priority to international law, but even a dualist country will give priority to international law. Well, is there any obligation to share information of disaster? I have an information, or India has an information in her hands regarding possible cyclone, then is India bound to provide that information to Bangladesh, which may be affected by that particular disaster or cyclone? The answer is yes. There is an obligation. There is an obligation. It says that all states should have procedures in place to facilitate the expeditious sharing of information about disasters. So I have to share that particular information expeditiously. I must not cause any sort of delay in sharing that particular information, including emerging hazards that are likely to cause disasters with other states, and assisting humanitarian organizations as appropriate, including the United Nations Emergency Relief Coordinator, in order to minimize transboundary impacts and maximize the effectiveness of any international assistance that might be required at that particular time. Well, then there is a specific obligation that has been provided by that particular IDRL soft guideline, that it is a duty and obligation of course, in the nature of soft law, of each and every state to adopt a comprehensive legal framework, a comprehensive institutional framework. And recently, after the adoption of these guidelines, we have witnessed that in many countries, the process has been already started to adopt some comprehensive laws, comprehensive policies, and planning in order to properly face disasters. Well, I must talk something about the SAARC agreement on rapid response to natural disasters, because that is also a very important regional document for all of us that deals with rapid response to natural disasters. And the guidelines, some of these guidelines provided in the SAARC agreement are similar with the IDRL guidelines. For example, this particular SAARC agreement says that it is the obligation of the states to exchange information and provision for mutual assistance. And Article 4.5 of this particular SAARC agreement says that the obligation to take legislative, administrative, and other measures. So that same thing, to adopt that particular comprehensive legal framework that was directed in the IDRL guidelines as well. Well, and one of the most important things that have been designed in the SAARC agreement is about the adoption of standard operating procedure for continuing that particular assistance program. Well, that also says that it may request assistance from any member state directly or through the Secretary General of SAARC. Very, very important provision. And Article 4.3 says that lays down provision for immediately responding to a disaster occurring within their territories and sharing information if the disaster is likely to impact other member states with a view to minimizing consequences. Well, now let us come to the next point on coordination of international disaster assistance and roles and responsibilities of different institutions relating to international disaster assistance. Well, coordination and roles and responsibilities of different institutions. Well, what is the basis and the standard of coordination? The basis and the standard will be international law. So paragraph 3 says that must be consistent with international law. So it must comply with international legal standard. That's the first thing to say. Secondly, a comprehensive plan is to be adopted. Paragraph 8 says, and guideline 4 that says about the responsibilities of assisting actors. So the states that are rendering assistance sometimes become very doubtful in the receiving states that is there any motive behind rendering that particular assistance, or is that going to destroying the culture of that particular country maybe, or is there any secondary religious purpose behind rendering that particular assistance? So international legal principles, there are certain specific provisions regarding the responsibilities of assisting actors. Those include, number one, 8 priorities are calculated on the basis of need alone, that what the actual needs. Secondly, that assistance is provided without any adverse distinction, without making any sort of distinction on the basis of race, ethnicity, religious beliefs, class, gender, disability, age, and political opinions to disaster-affected persons. It must be ensured, because this is one of the jus cogens or peremptory norms of international law that cannot be disregarded by any international law, that each and every exercise of international legal principle is to be made without making any sort of distinction on the basis of race, color, or anything. Then that assistance is to be provided without seeking to further a particular political or religious standpoint, intervene in the internal affairs of the affected state, or obtain commercial gain from charitable assistance. You cannot go for marketing of your own brand in the name of assistance. You cannot do that. Okay, and it must be ensured that it is not used as a means to gather sensitive information of a political, economic, or military nature that is irrelevant to disaster relief or initial recovery assistance. So it has to be ensured that the states are making laws in line with these particular guidelines. Okay, then other responsibilities include responsive to the special needs of, if any, of women and particularly vulnerable groups. This is a particular instruction provided to assisting actors that look at who are the vulnerable groups, and a receiving state may make an elaborate law in this regard that a country which is rendering assistance must be focusing on the needs of vulnerable groups first. So that has to be exercised in that particular way shown by the legislation of a particular country. Okay, so there are a lot of other directions. I'm not going through all those things one by one. Please go through those guidelines regarding coordination. And now I'm coming to the next point, that is about requesting and terminating international assistance. It has to be ensured that the assistance was made on the basis of the request made by the country. It's very important. And the receiving state also cannot just suddenly terminate that particular assistance activities. Must be done after making a proper notification. And at the time of initiation of military relief, extra care has to be adopted, that only at the request or with the express consent of the affected state, after having considered comparable civilian alternatives. We must have to look at that point, whether there are enough alternatives. If the alternatives are not considered to be sufficient, then of course we can go for military relief as well. There's no harm. Okay, then obligation to share information. Yes, there is an obligation to share information. And from guidelines 16 to 24, I'm finishing soon because my time is coming to an end. The guidelines 16 to 24, those guidelines deal actually with legal facilities to international assisting actors. I'm not going through in detail. I'm just saying that there are certain initiatives that have to be ensured by each and every receiving state. For example, the laws regarding formalities to be performed regarding visa, customs, duties, and for example, a particular receiving state must waive VAT and other duties on different equipments that are coming from the assisting countries in order to facilitate the disaster assistance operation. So these are the legal facilities which are to be rendered to international assisting actors. Very briefly, these are the guidelines which are provided to make the laws in line with that particular international legal standard. And apart from this thing, I'd like to end my speech with a few points with which Professor Amita Singh actually started her lecture, that the concept of public trust doctrine. I like that particular point that was raised by Professor Amita Singh. This is a very important legal principle in international law, doctrine of public trust, which has been, interestingly, got its affirmation in most of the constitutional jurisdictions around the world. If you talk about USA constitutional law, Indian constitutional law, Bangladeshi constitutional law, there are some significant landmark Supreme Court judgments on the point of the public trust doctrine, and public interest litigation is also another important part on which Professor Amita Singh focused. And what I'd like to add with that particular statement is that public interest litigation is an alternative option. Sometimes Americans say that, yes, Indian judiciary is very proactive, Bangladeshi judiciary is also very active, but that shows another side of governance. If the executive becomes lethargic, then judiciary naturally becomes stronger. So if we do comply with the international legal standard regarding our legislative functions, executive functions, then the courts will eventually become less burdened, which will be good for all of us. With these points, I must come to an end, I think. Thank you so much.
Monica, you are on mute.
Hello.
Yeah, audible now.
Thank you, Professor Ikramul Haque, for such an exhaustive session wherein you have dealt in with all the complexities at length and all the directives and all the international law and the nitty-gritties of the international law and the municipal law and all the guidelines. And we will be very grateful if you could email your PPT to us so that we can give the access to our participants also, because the PPT itself is very exhaustive and very heavy with knowledge, lot of information as a matter of fact. So I would like to request the participants, if there are any questions, kindly paste them in the chat box.
Well, I've already received one question in the chat box. Can I start answering with that question?
Yes, sure, sir.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Jayashree. You have raised a very important issue that at the time of rendering international assistance, how will you ensure that that international actor is actually reaching the people? For example, there is a question regarding international assistance which has been rendered to Afghanistan, that are the international actors reaching to the people or reaching to Taliban? It's a big question. So it is indeed a very practical question. And for that reason, as I've already mentioned in my speech about the IDRL guidelines, that it has to be ensured that the international assistance is reaching the right people, without any sort of distinction to be made on the basis of race, color, sex, or anything like that. And that has to be ensured by ensuring another important thing that has been developed in international practice. As I have already said, that in international law, sometimes state practice is more important than the actual letters of law. So if you look at the international practice, then we'll see that in international disaster law, there is a principle which has been developed in practice, that is involvement of civil society and the people from different sectors in a society. So if it can be ensured that, international actors, they have involved, of course, through the government, but they have involved civil society and people from different sections and community, then perhaps it will be easier, not certain, to ensure that they are actually reaching the people. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Akram. So what do you say really when, in an age of Twitters and social media, you find everybody showing empathy, sympathy? You've seen in Afghanistan, you've seen in Ukraine war, we've seen in Pakistan, but the real, donations, the real help does not reach thanks to diplomacy or the geopolitical reasons. How does one ensure that, we don't stop at Twitterati, but do real work? And maybe, there could be some, if not a law, some ethical code of conduct, for the people who show empathy and sympathy, but do not really come forward to give help. I'm speaking in terms of countries, not people per se.
Yes, you're absolutely right, and I do agree with you. And that is one problem that only can be solved perhaps by upgrading our morality and ethics and public morality. And that's why sometimes it is told that international public morality is always much more important than international law. Thank
Yes.
you, Jayashree.
Thank you so much.
Sir, I have a question, if
Sure,
you may allow. Yeah.
sure,
So
Dr. Gavi.
we talked about at the international level, we talked about IDRL guidelines. If we talk about the national level, we have, especially after the Asian tsunami of 2005, every country is coming up with their domestic law, national law. But at the regional level, how do you see how we can manage a regional treaty on cooperation in matters of disaster relief and response? If you may, please shed some light on that.
If we consider it regionally, then we have an important document, that is the SARC agreement. And if we can activate that properly, I think this is a very good enough a document, which is good enough. But our goodwill and intention is required in order to properly implement that particular treaty. And perhaps from our South Asian perspective, we have to be more confident about ourselves that we can solve our own problems if we take more initiatives in a united way, perhaps.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Do we have any other question? Anybody is having any question, any query? Okay. I think we had a very brilliant session with the great speakers. And as far as law is concerned, the whole idea at the end of the day that where are the rights and who has the duty to protect them. And as Professor Amita very correctly pointed out, and as Professor Ikramul Haq also ended with the doctrine of public trust and the Pacta Sunt Servanda, that promises made must be kept. And where is the liability of the state when it comes to the protection of its citizens from disasters? Today, as we are talking right now, the Silicon Valley of India, Bangalore, is facing floods. Madhya Pradesh in India is facing floods, and our neighboring country Pakistan is more than half of the country is facing floods. But what is the liability of the state when it comes to protection? And as Professor Amita Singh correctly pointed out, that whether these are disasters really natural anymore, most of them are man-made. The massive and rapid construction on the riverbeds and the violation of building bylaws has led to this kind of destruction. And as far as the law is concerned, we connect the dots to the Professor Sumaiya Khair's intervention on transparency and accountability, that what is the accountability of these initiatives, what is the accountability of these developmental programs. And as Professor Ikramul Haq very correctly pointed out, that international disaster law is not in any straitjacket formula. It is very wide. It is stretching from all the laws, and it is going from laws to laws to laws. The building bylaws are part of it. Environmental laws are part of it. Anti-corruption laws are part of it. So where do we stop? Where does the buck stops at the is the real question when we are delivering on, or when we are deliberating on the issue of disaster law. So I think we have covered lots and lots of issues, and Professor Amita Singh, Professor Sumaiya Khair, and Professor Ikramul Haq has pointed out all the very important points, issues, and all the gray areas as far as the disaster law is concerned. And I think this is the issue which needs to be tackled with utmost sincerity by all the administrative institutions. And as Professor Sumaiya Khair also talked about, that there is absence of grievance redressal system when it comes to disaster. And as I said, that who is accountable? Where do the people who are hard hit by disasters? And when someone is hit by disasters, there is loss of infrastructure, but there's loss of life. There is loss of opportunities. And when we are talking about disaster, what happens post disaster? Crime like human trafficking, crime like black market marketing, and all these hoarding, all that happens. And citizens' rights, at the end of the day, human rights are violated. I think we had a very fantastic session, and we thank on behalf of NDRG all our panelists, and we are grateful that you took time from a busy schedule and gave us your time and shared your knowledge and insights with us on the very prominent and important topic that is disaster law. Thank you. Professor Amita Singh, you have anything to add? You're on mute, ma'am.
I just have to thank the eminent speakers for their very, very insightful and deep understanding of the subject and also of the communication skills. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, everybody.
Before we end the session, may I request all the participants to please open their video for a while so that we can take a snapshot of everyone. Yeah. Everyone, please start your please open your video. Yes. Okay, thank you. So tomorrow we'll be meeting at the same time. Tomorrow we have a very important session on disaster economics, and two very known and very well-known resource persons, one from NDMA, Dr. Krishna Vatsti, and Professor Amindranath Bhattacharya from University of Burdwan will be joining us tomorrow. So same time, 4:30 p.m. The link will be same joining link. You have to join from the same link that we have shared. So thank you very much.
You're on mute, ma'am.